I'd like you to go ahead and take your Bibles and turn over to Leviticus chapter 16. Leviticus chapter 16, and we're going to read a section of the atonement ceremony here in the Old Testament that God instructed the high priest to perform in Israel. So Leviticus chapter 16, if you're there, we're going to look and read in verse 7. Starting in verse 7, Leviticus 16, "And he shall take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and Aaron shall cast lots upon the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord, the other lot for Azazel." And I'll use Azazel instead of scapegoat, because that's the meaning of it. That's the word, Hebrew word. "And Aaron shall bring the goat upon which the Lord's lot fell, and offer him for a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell will be the Azazel, and it shall be presented alive before the Lord to make an atonement with him and to let him go for Azazel into the wilderness." So the annual Day of Atonement, which the Jews call Yom Kippur, was the central event of Israel's sacrificial calendar, and it provided a way to bring the people back into a relationship with God, back close to God again. Because holiness, the holiness of God, and the sins of the people, the sins that were piled up in the tabernacle, were incompatible with one another. And God wanted to dwell with his people. This is why he put a tabernacle, a temple there. He wanted to dwell with them. And one way that he made that happen was to institute the daily ritual sacrifices. We know that there were daily sacrifices regularly for the nation. And there were individual sacrifices that people brought for their sins to be cleansed. But the sacrifices for sins at the tabernacle, the temple as it came to be, dirtied up the dwelling place of God. It made it a dirty place. And so God would set, he decided in the Bible, to set one day a year to clean the tabernacle or the temple out. Completely clean it out and cleanse it because of what the people had done to dirty it up. To completely clean it out from the sin, to take the sin far away from the people, far away from the tabernacle where God dwelt. He wanted that away from him. And so this pattern of the 2 goats pointed to a greater sacrifice of Jesus Christ. That's the one for the Lord. And also the binding of Satan. And that's the author of sin. That's the one for Azazel. Now, some have mistakenly come to the conclusion that both goats symbolize Jesus Christ. I think in many of the commentaries you'll read that. That would be a wrong rendering or understanding. There are a few commentaries that will show that one means Christ, the other is for the rendering for Satan. So I want to look at this idea today in the time we have to help us understand that the 2 goats indeed do represent Jesus Christ, one for the Lord, and Satan, one for Azazel. Hold your spot in Leviticus 16 here. You put the little marker there. I'm going to break a rule here. We're going to go to a few more scriptures than I should go into a sermonette. But hold your spot here. Just look over at Leviticus 23. Actually, forget that. Look, I'm going to read Leviticus 23 real short here. It says in Leviticus 23:27, "Also on the 10th day of the 7th month there shall be a day of atonement." Okay. So the word atonement in the Hebrew in Leviticus 23 is kippur. That's what the word is. Or kippurim, I guess is what you'll see, the kippurim. Or the Day of Atonings, the Day of Atonings. Now, why is it called the Day of Atonings, plural? Why is it called Day of Atonings? And I think we can see that here in Leviticus chapter 16, why this is the case, as the atonement ceremony is laid out. Look at verse 11. "Aaron shall bring the bull of the sin offering, which is for himself, and make atonement for himself and for his house." And then look at verse 16. "So he shall make atonement for the holy place, because of the uncleanness of the children of Israel, because of their transgressions, for all their sins, and so he shall do for the tabernacle of meeting, which remains among them in the midst of their uncleanness. And look at verse 17. There shall be no man in the tabernacle of meeting when he goes in to make atonement in the holy place until he comes out, that he may make an atonement for whom? For himself, for his household, and for all the assembly of Israel. And verse 18, he shall go out to the altar that is before the Lord and make atonement for it. And verse 20, and that when he has made the end of atoning for what? For the holy place, for the tabernacle of meeting, and for the altar. Now look at verse 10. But the goat on which the lot fell to be for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement upon it, and it to let go for Azazel into the wilderness. You see all the atonements that are taking place here? Several of them. The high priest made atonement for himself and then for his family. Actually, in that rendering, what it means is the priestly family. And then there would be an atonement made for the whole tribes of Israel, all of Israel. Also, atonement was made for the tabernacle, the holy place, the meeting place. It was made for the altar, the incense of, where the incense was burned. All these places, there was an atonement made for it. That's a lot of atoning going on, isn't it? A lot of it. Now, I asked my kids this last night. When you think of the word atonement, what do you think of? What kind of comes to your mind? What synonym comes to your mind? Well, I kind of think that most people might think atonement means forgiveness. And there's the sense, I think, in a reaching way that it can mean forgiveness. But that's not exactly what atonement means. Some of the sages in the past have argued that taking the word to its root means ransom. Others have said it means wiping away because it has that same sense in Aramaic. But we don't see that in the Hebrew Bible. I think the best meaning for atonement is covering. It's a covering. All throughout Leviticus 16, the Hebrew word for atonement is kafar. It's the root of kippur. And kafar means to cover over. That's what it means, to cover over. So we see that all these things were covered over in the tabernacle, in the tent. And I want to look at this for a bit to understand the purpose of the two goats. If atonement meant forgiveness, wouldn't it seem strange to make atonement for the altar and for the tent of meeting? To forgive a non-living, inanimate object, in other words, is what I'm saying, that's stained, with sin. You see, in these cases, atonement is referencing a place, like the holy place, or where the cause that makes the kafar, the covering, right, necessary, is not only sin and transgression, but defilement and impurity. So we read in Leviticus 16, verse 16, so he shall make atonement for the holy place. Why? He says, because of the uncleanness of the children of Israel and because of their transgressions for all their sins. Because they piled up over the year. They piled up. Now I'd like you to hold your spot and turn to Genesis chapter 32. I want you to hold on to some of those things I've been telling you about here at the beginning. And let's look at an account here in Genesis 32 of Jacob and Esau, because I think there's something in here that's important that will teach us something. Genesis 32, and I want you to look at verse 20. Genesis 32 and verse 20, I'm going to break into the account here. This is where Esau was coming. Jacob saw him from afar. They're going to come together, and Jacob is going to say something here. Verse 20, and also say, behold, your servant Jacob is behind us. For he said, I will appease him with the present that goes before me, and afterward I will see his face, perhaps he will accept me. So here we have Jacob is very concerned about Esau. You remember he set his family in order. If you remember that story, set his family in order behind him, and he's like, what am I going to do now my brother's coming here? Because I took his birthright away from him. So he's very concerned about that. And he says this, I will appease. And that word appease is kafar. That's atone. That's atone. Him is panim or panah. And that is means face. So they've translated to him, Esau. Some will actually say Esau. So I will atone Esau, or I will atone against his face, or I will atone him. Now, what is he saying here? How's he doing this? He's doing this by, it says, presenting what's going before, or giving him presents. So appease means to cover over. Him is the word for face or presence. And it also means at the depth of it, of his anger. Because he's worried about Esau. He's worried about Esau's anger. So some sages have understood this to mean that Jacob was offering Esau presents so that he could cover and hide from Esau's anger. And that's the way we can look at this. He was offering something. In fact, it says in Hebrews that, the high priest would go into the temple, the tabernacle, with gifts and sacrifices. There were presents that were offered, gifts and sacrifices. Sometimes we don't think about this, but we use this in a common way today. I was in a subway a few years ago, and I had a gentleman in front of me who was pulling out his money for a sandwich. He didn't have enough money. And so he was trying to figure out what to do, and I said, I got you covered. And so I paid for the sandwich. Or you've probably said it to the people, a check comes along, I'll cover it. Well, what does that mean? What do you really mean when you're saying that? I got you covered, I'll cover you. Well, I think really what it means is I'm going to cover over what you lack, because if you don't pay the price for your sandwich, that clerk's going to get angry at you. Wouldn't they? They would. So that's kind of that we kind of use this in terminology today. We're going to cover over something. So Jacob is saying, I'll cover over myself and create a barrier between Esau's anger and myself. So when we look at Leviticus 16 and it reads, you shall make an atonement for the holy place, this inanimate object, it means that the blood will be a protection and a covering so that it won't be destroyed by God because of all the impurities that have piled up from the sins of Israel. In other words, the impurity and the sins represent a danger to the sanctuary, and the blood covers over and it protects it. So just as a covering was made for the altar, the holy place, and the tent, the blood did the same for the high priest. And it did the same for the people as well. It created a covering, and it served as a protection and a covering by offering an appeasement for the sins and impurities of the people that was brought before the tabernacle. But now there's one other thing here that's an important aspect. When we look at the case of Jacob and Esau, the Hebrew word panim, some have interpreted as sort of meaning this anger. It doesn't really give the full meaning of what's happening. Because when you take into account the whole background and you think about the whole backstory of Jacob and Esau and their impending encounter, panim includes proximity. It includes nearness. It includes their being close together. In other words, Jacob wasn't really worried about Esau when he was far away. Jacob was worried about Esau when he came into proximity. This is that panim. They've come face to face. They've come close to each other. Or he's very concerned about it soon to be happening. So the atoning of Jacob takes place because of the presence of the two of them together. This is why this is happening. And it seems that there is this same meaning that's intended with Leviticus and atoning. The presence of God in the tabernacle in the face of the sins of the people are not tenable. They cannot coexist together. So the blood of the first goat accomplishes the task of covering the tabernacle and the people. All those things that have been dirtied by sin, he covers it over. But the sins still need to be removed, and they need to be taken away from the presence of God. And this is a concept I'd like you to see in Isaiah chapter 27. Isaiah chapter 27. And look at verse 9. Isaiah 27 and verse 9. Therefore, by this the iniquity of Jacob will be covered. That's kafar. Or you could say atoned. It will be covered. How? It says by this. How? And this is all the fruit of the taking away of sin. When he makes all the stones of the altar like chalk stones that are beaten to dust, wooden images and incense altars shall not stand. When these things are taken away, then atonement's made. So when all the sins are taken away, atonement is accomplished. David has the same expression in using the removal of sin in Psalm 103, verse 12. He says, as far as east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. And back in Leviticus 16. So the atonement ceremony isn't complete until the second goat is brought to the high priest and all the sins of Israel are cast onto the live goat. It's not actually until the second goat has done what he needs to do, the high priest will actually wash his garments and change his clothes into the regular garments that he would wear as a high priest. But on this time, during this particular time, he wears the white garments. Leviticus 16:21, Aaron shall lay both hands, on the head of the live goat and cast over it all the iniquities of the children of Israel and all their transgressions. What all? The same all that were covered. All of those that were covered will be cast on the goat concerning all their sins, putting them on the head of the goat, and shall send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a suitable man. So the sins are then sent back to the author, to the originator of sin. It's almost like a retracing occurs. And there's a cleanup every year for God's people, and Israel was practicing God's plan. Because the second goat, which is for Azazel, is one that would be taken into the wilderness where people don't habitate, where it's far away from God. And we see a New Testament cognate of this in Revelation chapter 20. Revelation chapter 20. I think a verse that we all know very well here pertaining to the Day of Atonement and the picturing of Satan being bound. Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 3. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he cast him in the bottomless pit and shut him up and set a seal on him so that he should deceive the nations no more till 1,000 years were finished. But after these things, he must be released for a little while. But then there's the final putting away of Satan in verse 10. The devil who deceived them was cast into the lake of fire with brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet were. And he will never be again, and we will never see him. So the two goats really should be thought of as performing one action in tandem, a kind of a goat tag team that cleans the defilement from God's presence. The first goat covers over the sins, and the second goat carries those sins far away. And that goat would never return, and thus Israel's past sins would never return either. And God's dwelling place was cleansed, and Israel was cleansed, and Israel could continue to dwell in God's presence as a forgiven and a cleansed people.